Hello children, welcome back to your English class. Now we will start chapter 9, the grey stone face 1. So let's begin the chapter, the grey stone face. But before we start the chapter, let's know something about the author or the writer. Nathaniel Hawthorne is the writer of this chapter, and he was born on July 4th, 1804 in US and died on May 19, 1864. He was an American novelist and short story writer who was a master of the allegorical and symbolic tale. He was one of the greatest fiction writers in American literature, and he is best known for the Scarlet Letter that was written in 1850 and the House of the Seven Gables that was written in 1851. Now let's start our chapter, that is on page number 124. But before we read out the story, let's read out before you read. Seen from a distance, hilltops and huge rocks seems to assume various shapes. They may resemble an animal or a human figure. People attribute stories to these shapes. Some stories come true, others don't. The grey stone face is one such shape that reminds the inhabitants of the valley of a prophecy. What was it? Did it come true? By this we understand that if we see mountains or the hills from a distant place, they look like some animal figure or the human figure, and very often the people create stories on the basis of those images. So sometimes it may happen those stories come true. So the grey stone face is such kind of story. So let's begin our chapter. One afternoon, when the sun was going down, a mother and a little boy sat at the door of their cottage, talking about the great stone face. They had only to lift their eyes, and there it was, plain to be seen, though miles away, with the sunshine brightening all its features. And what was the grey stone face? So in this para, we understand that one afternoon a mother with a little son, Ernest, the name of the son was Ernest, was sitting at the door of their cottage. They were talking about the great stone face. It was clearly visible in the bright sunshine. The grey stone face was a work of nature, formed on the perpendicular side of a mountain by some immense rocks, which had been thrown together so that when viewed at a proper distance, they resembled the features of a human face. If the spectator approached too near, he lost the outline of the enormous face and could see only a heap of gigantic rocks piled one upon another. But seen from a distance, the clouds clustering about it, the great stone face seemed positively to be alive. It was the belief of many people that the valley owed much of its fertility to the benign face that was continually beaming over it. So by this para, we understand that thousands of people lived there. There means in the valley. Everybody there was familiar with the grey stone face, and it was a work of nature. Some huge rocks joined looked like the features of a human face from a distance. It also looked alive. A mother and a little boy, as we said earlier, sat at the door of their cottage, gazing at the great stone face and talking about it. The child's name was Ernest. Mother, said he, while the great face smiled on him. I wish that it could speak, for it looks so very kindly that its voice must indeed be pleasant. If I ever see a man with such a face, I should love him very much. If an old prophecy should come to pass, answered his mother, we may see a man sometime with exactly such a face as that. What prophecy do you mean, dear mother? Eagerly inquired Ernest. Please tell me about it. So his mother told him a story that her own mother had told her when she herself was younger than little Ernest, that at some future day a child should be born near here who was destined to become the greatest and noblest person of his time, and whose face in manhood should bear an exact resemblance to the great stone face. Many still had faith in this old prophecy, but others took it to be nothing but idle talk. At all events, the great man of the prophecy had not yet appeared. "Oh, mother," cried Ernest, clapping his hands above his head, "I do hope that I shall live to see him." His mother was an affectionate and thoughtful woman. It was proper, she thought, not to discourage the fanciful hopes of a little boy. So she said to him, "Perhaps you may." And Ernest never forgot the story that his mother told him. It was always in his mind whenever he looked upon the great stone face. He spent his childhood in the log cottage where he was born, was dutiful to his mother and helpful to her in many things, assisting her much with his little hands and more with his loving heart. In this manner, from a happy yet often pensive child, he grew up to be a mild and quiet youth. Ernest had had no teacher, but the great stone face became one to him. When the work of the day was over, he would gaze at it for hours, until he began to imagine that those vast features recognized him and gave him a smile of kindness and encouragement. So, in short, we understand by these paragraphs that the giant face smiled on Ernest and looked kindly. He wished to hear its pleasant voice. He longed to see a man with such a face in order to love him dearly. The mother reminded Ernest of the prophecy. It was that a child would be born there. He would become the greatest and noblest person of his time. In manhood, his face would bear true likeness to the great stone face. The people had waited for such a person in vain. The little boy hoped to live and see him. The mother strengthened his fancy. Ernest was a helpful and happy child. He grew up to be a mild and quiet youth. About this time, there went a rumour throughout the valley that the great man who was to bear a resemblance to the great stone face had appeared at last. It seems that many years before, a young man had left the valley and settled at a distant seaport. Gathergold, which was his name, had set up as a shopkeeper, and being sharp in business matters, had become so very rich that it would have taken him 100 years only to count his wealth. In time, he thought of his native valley and decided to go back there and end his days where he had been born. Ernest had been deeply stirred by the idea that the great man, the noble man, the man of prophecy, after so many ages of delay, was at length to be seen in his native valley. While the boy was still gazing up the valley one day and imagining that the great stone face returned his gaze, the noise of the wheels was heard, and a crowd of people cried, "Here comes the great Mr Gathergold." A carriage drawn by 4 horses dashed round the turn of the road. Within it, thrust partly out of the window, appeared the face of an old man with yellow skin, the very image of the grey stone face. Shouted the people. Sure enough, the old prophecy is true. Here we have the great man at last. And what greatly puzzled Ernest, they seemed actually to believe that here was the likeness which they spoke of. He turned away sadly from the wrinkled shrewdness of that unpleasant face and gazed up the valley, where the stone face seemed to say, "He will come. Fear not, Ernest, the man will come." Now, let's see the explanation of these paragraphs. A young man named Gathergold had left the valley many years before. He had become quite a rich man there. He decided to return to his native valley. There was a rumor that Gathergold looked like the great stone face. Gathergold had the face of an old man with yellow skin. The people considered him the image of the great stone face. Ernest gazed up the valley. The stone face seems to reject Gathergold as its likeness.